The son of Moses who disappeared from history. And what happened to him? You know the story of Moses, but what about his sons? The greatest prophet of the Old Testament, the man who spoke to God face to face, had descendants who simply vanished from the Bible. No great victories, no leadership, no evident legacy. And the strangest part, the word so detailed remains silent. Is there something that God wanted to hide, or is it this very silence that holds the greatest revelation? Perhaps what's missing from the narrative isn't a mistake, but a message, a warning, a hidden spiritual alert right in the midst of what remains unsaid. The story that nobody tells might be the one we need to hear the most. What if everything you think about legacy, family, and calling is about to be turned upside down? The strangest silence in the Bible. It's curious. The Bible is a book that loves to tell stories. It talks about genealogies with hundreds of names, narrates the lives of kings and shepherds, even reveals the intimate failures of grand characters. But when we reach the sons of Moses, yes, that Moses, the text seems mute. Gershom and Eliezer are mentioned at the beginning, almost like footnotes in the main story. After that, nothing, not a line, a silence so loud that it nearly screams. Why does the word, so rich in detail, go silent just about the children of Israel's greatest leader? Imagine Moses in the desert of Midian, holding his firstborn in his arms. He looks at the baby and says, "I am a foreigner in a strange land. I will name him Gershom." Exodus 2:22. And in that almost poetic name, there was already a deep pain, a feeling of being out of place. The man who would speak face to face with God begins his story of fatherhood with a sense of dislocation. Did this feeling also linger over his sons? Is the biblical silence, in fact, the echo of a fatherhood marked by distance? Later, in Exodus 18, we see Moses reuniting with his family. Zipporah, his wife, returns with Gershom and Eliezer, accompanied by Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. It's a beautiful moment, but brief, a reunion without tears described, without hugs recorded, without emotional dialogues. The Bible, which narrates conversations between donkeys and prophets, doesn't dedicate a single word to what Moses said upon seeing his children after so long. What does this reveal about his relationship with them? Is the absence of words a mirror of a larger absence? Now think with me. If even the children of David, Aaron, and Abraham have entire chapters dedicated to their paths, why are the children of Moses, the liberator, the lawgiver, the man who saw God, almost erased from history? Was it an oversight, a divine editorial choice, or something deeper? The secret things belong to the Lord our God. Deuteronomy 29:29 says the Scripture. But perhaps this silence isn't just a mystery. Perhaps it's a message. What if the silence about Gershom and Eliezer is a subtle warning, a reminder that it's not enough to be great before the people if at home there's emptiness? How many leaders today lose themselves in public success while their families fade into the shadows of forgetfulness? The question remains, do you believe it's possible to fulfill a calling without neglecting your children? Let me know in the comments below, because perhaps this reflection reveals more about us than it does about Moses. A name that carries pain and dislocation. Can you imagine the weight of a name? Gershom, the firstborn of Moses, was born far from the promised land, away from his ancestral lineage, away from everything an Israelite would call home. His name means foreigner there. Now think with me. What father, holding his child for the first time, chooses such a name filled with sadness? It wasn't a mistake, nor a coincidence. It was an outburst. Moses was saying, "This boy will grow up feeling the same pain I do, the pain of not belonging." And so, even before speaking, Gershom already carried a lament in his chest. It's as if his name was a living scar. Moses wasn't just describing where he lived, but where he didn't live. He had fled Egypt, but had yet to find a home. Midian was refuge, not destination. And Gershom, with that name, was the constant reminder that something was still missing. Have you ever felt that way? In a place that seems safe, but isn't exactly where your heart wants to be? Well, Gershom's name carries that restlessness, that no place where many of us still live in silence. Now, look at the contrast. While Moses was called by God at the burning bush, his son was growing up far away, with a name that kept him on the margins. Moses climbed mountains, spoke with angels, challenged kings. Gershom, he disappears from the narrative. It's as if the very biblical text echoed his name, foreigner there, as if to say he doesn't belong here. And that hurts, because we all want to belong. We all want to be part of something greater. But Gershom seems to have been excluded even from the story. And here comes the question that won't go away. Was it just a symbolic name or a sealed destiny? How many times have labels, nicknames, judgments pushed us out of the main story? Proverbs 18:21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit." Did Moses, by naming his son with pain, also seal him with invisibility? What do you think about that? Write your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to hear your opinion. Maybe the lesson here is too profound to be overlooked. Names have power. Identity matters. And when we see ourselves as foreigners, we begin to act like foreigners. The good news, God is also an expert at changing names. He did it with Abram, with Jacob, with Simon. Who knows, Gershom, even far from the spotlight, had his identity restored away from the cameras of history. Perhaps what God wrote about him is stored in books we're yet to read. One day, the hidden family of the liberator. While Moses faced Pharaoh, watched the waters of the Nile turn to blood, and received instructions directly from God, his wife and children were far away. That's right. In Exodus 18:2, we find that Zipporah, Gershom, and Eliezer were with Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. They weren't by his side during the plagues, nor during the crossing of the Red Sea. They didn't see the staff turn into a serpent, nor hear the trumpets of liberation. Have you ever thought about that? Israel's liberator freed an entire people, but his own family was absent from the greatest turning point in history. Now imagine the scene. Moses returns from the mountain after speaking with God. His face shines with divine glory. But when he arrives at the tent, no one is waiting for him. Not Zipporah, not Gershom, not Eliezer, just silence. Is this the reality for many who live for a purpose and lose their home in the process? The Bible doesn't explain why Moses left them with Jethro, but what it reveals is deeper than it seems. There's a fine line between calling and negligence. Let's talk about today. How many people are so focused on the calling, ministry, career, projects, dreams, that they forget their family in some desert of Midian? We get caught up in the mission, the hustle, the sacred commitments, but leave behind those who should walk alongside us. Moses' example in this regard challenges us to reflect, am I saving the world but losing my home? In Matthew 16:26, Jesus asks, "What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world, yet loses his soul?" And I ask you, what if you lose your family? And there's more. The family's return only happens when Jethro brings them back, not by Moses' decision. Doesn't that sound strange to you? The leader of the people needs to be reminded of his own home. It may seem harsh, but it's real. How many times do we need someone from the outside to say, "Hey, look at your wife, look at your children"? The Bible is too wise to include that detail, even if in just a few lines, because sometimes what is said in silence weighs more than 1,000 words. The absence of Zipporah and the boys in the story doesn't diminish Moses as a leader, but perhaps reveals the emotional cost of an unbalanced leadership. A question that can change lives: who is being left behind while you move forward? Tell me in the comments. Sometimes the mission God gave you starts at home, and the voice you need to hear first isn't Pharaoh's. It's the voice of the child calling you from another room. Jethro, the silent link between two worlds. Jethro quietly appears in the biblical narrative, but his role is immense. He not only welcomed Moses in exile and received him as a son-in-law, but he also was responsible for bringing back the family that Moses had left behind. In Exodus.18, he arrives with Zipporah and the children, returning to the Hebrew leader what he didn't even know he had lost. But curiously, after this, the names of Gershom and Eliezer are never mentioned again. Why? Did their Midianite origin become a burden, something that made them spiritually ambiguous among a people seeking purity and unity? Remember that Jethro was a priest in Midian, a land with different customs, ancient alliances, and its own spirituality. His presence is like a bridge between worlds, between the desert and the promise, between exile and destiny. And when he disappears from the story, it seems that bridge also dissolves. And with it, Moses' sons disappear too. Did the mixed roots of Gershom and Eliezer make them incompatible with God's plan for Israel at that moment? Sometimes, what connects us to both sides leaves us with no place at all. And here's a strong reflection. There may be people living today like Moses' children, linked to purpose but forgotten by history. Perhaps you're trying to walk between two worlds, feeling that you belong to neither the past nor the future. But God sees the invisible. He knows those who remain in silence. And even when the Bible doesn't speak, heaven continues to write. If this message touched your heart, leave a like as a form of worship. It's like saying, "Lord, I also want to be remembered," and write a biblical phrase here in the comments that represents this spiritual truth. If you want, use this one I created. Even when history forgets me, heaven calls me by name. And if you feel this word has fed your faith, subscribe to the channel. Not because of numbers, but because this community is a place of care, teaching, and truth. Here we don't just give you information, we walk together toward what God is yet to reveal. When the Levites take center stage and Gershom vanishes, in Numbers 3, something curious happens. The Levites are separated by God for the service of the tabernacle, and among them appears the clan of the Gershonites. Yes, descendants of Gershom, son of Moses. But look, Gershom himself is not present in the scene. It's as if the curtain opened for a group bearing his name, but he himself was not invited to the stage. No words, no role, not even an honorable mention for the father of the clan. A subtle disappearance, but laden with meaning. What's curious is that, technically, Gershom is Moses' firstborn, and yet his name doesn't resonate strongly in Israel's spiritual functions. The descendants of Kohath, for example, the other Levitical clan, gain prominence. It's from them that the lineage of high priests will come, the names remembered, those who handled the sacred. Gershom, on the other hand, disappears like a candle blown out by the wind. Have you ever felt that way? As if everyone around you is being used by God, and you are just continuing the lineage, but without your own identity? It's as if a symbolic replacement were happening. The name of Gershom is replaced by the name of the group, Gershonites, and he himself stops being mentioned. This reminds us that sometimes our story gets diluted into something larger than we expected, and the prominence we imagined might not come. But does that mean God forgot us? Not at all. In 1 Corinthians 12:22, Paul writes, "On the contrary, those members of the body that seem to be weaker are necessary." Perhaps Gershom wasn't the most visible, but he was necessary. Some people carry the weight of a great name, a strong spiritual heritage, but don't know what to do with it when they're not recognized. It could be the pastor's son, the missionary's grandchild, the faithful intercessor's daughter. And when acknowledgement doesn't come, frustration takes the place of faith. But let me tell you something. God doesn't measure legacy by applause. He measures it by faithfulness in the hidden. Gershom may not have had a voice, but his descendants served the Lord. And that is already a legacy worthy of honor. Eleazar, the forgotten son who represented liberation. Unlike Gershom, whose name carried exile and pain, Eleazar was named with hope. "God is my help," said Moses, explaining the reason for his name, Exodus 18:4, a name that arises from the memory that the Lord had delivered him from Pharaoh's sword. This son, unlike the firstborn, carries in his very name the mark of divine intervention. And yet, he disappears. No story, no achievement. Not a single extra line. It's as if the liberation he represented had been shelved in the biblical narrative. It's hard not to feel a lump in your throat thinking about it. A name so full of faith, relief, rescue, and yet so surrounded by silence. As if the help of God was remembered only at the moment of birth and then forgotten. This speaks volumes about our lives. Sometimes we have powerful experiences with God, see his actions, receive promises, but the days go by. The dust of routine covers the miracles, and the memory of what he did fades away. Eleazar represents these sacred memories that we leave behind. But if his name meant "God is my help," perhaps the very silence of the text teaches us something. God's help doesn't need a stage. It can be silent, discreet, without spotlights, but it's there, holding everything together. Psalms 121, 1-2 reminds us of this. "I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord." Maybe Eleazar didn't disappear. Perhaps he is silently representing what God does when no one sees. How many times has God helped you and no one noticed? And how many times, even without recognition, did you remain steadfast, supported by him? Eleazar teaches us this. Not every miracle gets a chapter, but every miracle has eternal value. Just because your name isn't remembered doesn't mean your story was forgotten in heaven. What seems like anonymity is sometimes just God's care keeping something precious away from the noise of fame. A lineage that did not produce heroes. In the Bible, it's common to see children surpassing their parents. Joshua, Moses' servant, became the leader who conquered the promised land. Samuel, the result of prayer, was a judge and prophet. Solomon inherited David's throne and elevated Israel to its peak. But what about Moses' children? Nothing. No achievements, no leadership, no battles won. Doesn't that sound strange to you? The greatest prophet of the Old Testament had a silent lineage. The man who parted the sea didn't have heirs who even divided the Scripture's attention. And this shouldn't be read with disdain, but with weight, because somehow it seems Moses' story stopped with him. His staff wasn't passed on. His voice didn't echo in his children. Was it a divine choice? Was it a consequence of distance? Or was the mission God gave to Moses so unique that there was no possible successor within his own house? In Deuteronomy 34:10 we read, "Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses." And perhaps this "never again" began within his own tent. But this raises a delicate reflection. Are we confusing legacy with heredity? Because Moses left an immense legacy, laws, history, faith, just not in blood form. And perhaps God did it on purpose, to show us that calling doesn't follow human ties, but heavenly designs. Jesus said, "Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother, sister, and mother." Matthew 12:50. The lineage that truly matters is that of the Spirit, not just the surname. How many fathers and mothers live in distress because their children didn't follow the same path of faith? This topic cuts deep because it forces us to remember faith isn't genetic. It can be inspired, taught, cultivated, but never imposed. Moses' life teaches us the importance of sowing, but also of letting go. Trusting that even if the tree seems dry today, the root might be alive beneath the ground, and the seed that didn't bloom in your generation might sprout in the next. A priesthood that skipped Moses' house. Among all the divine decisions recorded in Exodus, one always causes a certain strangeness. God chooses Aaron, not Moses, to be Israel's first high priest. Exodus 28:1. Just Moses, the friend of God, the man of the burning bush, the one who received the tablets of the law. Why did the priesthood pass by his home? It's as if the gift of spiritual leadership slipped through the fingers of his lineage. Aaron and his sons were clothed with sacred garments. Moses? He remained a prophet but without an altar legacy. Not that Moses was lesser for it, on the contrary, but the divine choice here has a tone of separation. One served before the people, the other served before God in the temple. But what about Moses' children? They were left with neither. It's as if the blessing took a step to the side. This can hurt, especially when we think about our own children. The feeling that something spiritual skipped our home is one of the most silent pains of the faith journey. And we wonder, did God want to protect Moses' children from the pressure of the priesthood? Or was there something in the liberator's house that Moses himself couldn't pass on? Because the priesthood isn't an honor, it's a weight, a calling that demands more than inheritance. It requires surrender. Hebrews 5:4 reminds us, "No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was." Perhaps this divine choice was more mercy than exclusion. But this also teaches us that not everything God entrusts to us will be reproduced in our children. What is our calling is not automatically theirs. And that's okay. It's up to us to accept that the altar God builds may be in another tent. And trust that even if our children don't receive what we expected, they will receive what they need. Moses saw the glory. Aaron wore the ephod. Each had their part. And perhaps Moses' children received something that the texts don't reveal, but heaven hasn't forgotten. The Gershonites, a partially restored legacy. In 1 Chronicles 6:16-17, the Gershonites finally reappear. After so much silence, they are cited as part of the Levites, temple servants, carriers of sacred objects, guardians of holy things. But something is still missing. There's no explicit connection to Moses, no remembrance of the founding father, no son of Moses emblazoned with honor. It's as if the name Gershom had been preserved, but emptied of its origin. A distant echo, a faceless memory. It's almost like seeing an old portrait on the wall without a caption. You recognize the heritage, but don't know who exactly was behind it. Was this a type of restoration? A subtle attempt by God to reintroduce the name among the people, even if without prominence? It could be. But it could also be a warning. There are legacies that survive only by function, but not by identity. The Gershonites served, and that's beautiful. But the heart of the story still seemed wounded, incomplete. This leads us to a very practical lesson. Sometimes God allows something of ours to continue, but in a new format. Something we began with pain can turn into ministry down the line. Something that started with absence can end with service. Even if no one connects our name to the result, God knows the seed that was planted. Psalms 126:5 says, "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy." Perhaps Gershom sowed with tears, and his children reaped by serving at the altar. This part of the story is almost like a ray of hope. It's not a complete redemption, but a thread of continuity. The Bible doesn't close the door on Moses' lineage, it just leaves it ajar. The name Gershom reappears, and that's enough to show that in God's kingdom no seed falls to the ground in vain. Sometimes what seemed forgotten is just maturing out of our field of vision. When the calling dims, the family. Moses lived a mission that consumed everything. His body, his days, his thoughts, and perhaps even his family. He was the liberator, the lawgiver, the prophet. But as the story unfolds, the figure of the father begins to fade. There are no mentions of how he raised his children, nor of the moments he spent with them after the Exodus. Everything revolves around the people, the tent, the mountain, the tablets of the law. Have you ever thought about how relevant this is today? How many are so dedicated to ministry, work, and mission that they hardly notice their home is emptying? The children grow up without presence. The wife gets used to absence, all justified by purpose. But would the God who called Moses have ignored the pain of his own family? Certainly not. That's why the silence about the prophet's children cannot be overlooked. Perhaps it's a veiled warning, a silent scream in the narrative. Don't sacrifice your own on the altar of spiritual success. This point in the script is a turning point, because here we reach the spiritual climax of this story. It's no longer about the past, it's about us. Moses lived something that many of us still live, the dilemma between fulfilling a public calling and maintaining family intimacy. But Jesus taught us that the greatest commandment is to love God with all, and our neighbor as ourselves, Matthew 22:37-39. And who is the closest neighbor to us if not those in our home? The absence of Moses' sons in the story is an uncomfortable mirror. It makes us ask, am I hearing God's voice? But am I hearing my family's voice? Am I climbing spiritual mountains, but coming down to hug my own? The calling is beautiful. The mission is sacred. But when it begins to dim the image of those God placed beside us, perhaps it's time to adjust the focus. Because the same God who called Moses also calls us to be parents, mothers, present, whole, not just leaders for the world, but refugees for those living under our roof. The mystery of the Midianites, enemies or relatives. This part of the story is, at the very least, unsettling. In Numbers 31, God commands Moses to fight against the Midianites, the same Midianites with whom he had built ties. Jethro, his father-in-law, was a priest in Midian. Zipporah, his wife, was Midianite. And the children, half Israelites, half Midianites. Suddenly Moses must lead an army against the very people of his own family. The conflict here isn't just geopolitical, it's internal, intimate, painful. How does one divide the sword between mission and blood? Imagine the weight of giving an order that directly or indirectly hurts the very origin of your children. Did Gershom and Eleazar watch from afar as the war raged against their mother's people? Did this push them further away from their Israelite identity? The Bible doesn't tell us, but the silence, once again, is deafening. It seems Moses' children were caught between two worlds, too much to be fully Israelites, but too close to be merely Midianites, an identity dilemma that many still face today. Some people live in the same conflict, carrying different spiritual heritages, confusing family histories, cultures clashing within their own chest. And then they ask, where do I belong? But in Christ, we have an answer that transcends these walls. Ephesians 2:14 says, "For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." In God, no one is a foreigner. No blood is a reason for eternal division. Yet still the pain of choice exists, and it hurts. The mystery of the Midianites forces us to confront the tension between mission and origin, between obedience and family loyalty. It won't always be easy to balance this, but perhaps the great lesson here is this: God doesn't hide the conflicts of history. He includes them, and by including, he teaches. He teaches that faith doesn't negate affection, that obedience doesn't mean coldness, and that even the most used man by God had to deal with dilemmas that cut deep, when blood isn't enough. This is one of the most confrontational teachings in the entire narrative. Moses had children, had a story with God, had a legacy, but his blood wasn't enough to ensure spiritual continuity. Moses' children didn't stand out for their faith, didn't lead, didn't inspire generations. This forces us to face a harsh but liberating reality. Faith isn't inherited, it's lived. John the Baptist had already warned this when he said, "God can raise up children to Abraham from these stones." Matthew 3:9. Lineage isn't synonymous with calling, and this is where many people go wrong. They think that just because they come from a Christian family, everything is already resolved. That being the pastor's child or grandchild of a believer guarantees them coverage. But God doesn't work with surnames. He works with hearts. The example of Moses' children shows that no one lives on inherited spiritual credit. Each person needs to find their own encounter with God, their own burning bush, their own desert. And if on one hand this is frightening, on the other it brings hope, because it means no one is limited by the past, not by the absence of a legacy, not by family silence. Faith is accessible to all, regardless of the name. It's a daily construction. A yes at a time, a personal altar. And this also calls us to responsibility. To educate children in the way is our duty, Proverbs 22:6. But each one will have to decide whether they want to walk it. Not even Moses could do that for his own. Moses' blood wasn't enough for continuity, but Christ's blood is. He is the one who adopts us, transforms us, and makes us heirs, not by genetic inheritance, but by spiritual redemption. And that changes everything. Because it means you can be the first in your generation to raise an altar, or perhaps the last of a lineage that got lost, that decided to start over, and God loves fresh starts. He is a master at resurrecting stories that everyone thought were closed. What if there were more hidden things? In 1 Chronicles 23:16, almost like a lost whisper in the midst of genealogies, a name emerges: Shebuel, son of Gershom, son of Moses, a direct descendant that almost nobody knows. With no recorded achievements, no stories told, no spotlights, just a name. But what if there were more? What if other children, grandchildren, voices and stories existed, but the Spirit decided not to reveal them? Not because they weren't important, but because silence also carries a purpose. It's possible that the greatest legacy of Moses' children happened in anonymity. Perhaps Shebuel was a man of faith. Perhaps he prayed silently behind the scenes while others shone. Perhaps he served faithfully, never receiving recognition. And you know what that reminds me of? So many servants of God today who live far from the stages but close to the heart of God. Hebrews 6:10 comforts us. For God is not unjust to forget your work and the love you have shown toward his name. Not everything that matters is recorded in books, but it's engraved in heaven. This last topic invites us to ask an uncomfortable yet powerful question. Are we trying to appear more than serve? Are we seeking public recognition while neglecting intimacy with God? Moses' children may have been erased from the narrative of men, but perhaps they were notable in God's eyes, and in the end, that's what matters. Eternity won't be measured by how many applauded us, but by how many days we walked with God even when no one saw. The Bible, with its divine wisdom, doesn't say everything. It gives us what is necessary, and sometimes what is necessary is silence, because silence teaches us to seek. It teaches us to trust that not everything will be answered now. There are stories we will only understand on the other side of eternity. And perhaps Moses' children are there, not as forgotten, but as witnesses that the invisible to God is never irrelevant. The story of Moses' children is, at once, both a void and a revelation. Gershom, Eleazar, Shebuel, names that passed almost in silence, yet scream powerful messages for those with attentive spiritual ears. God allowed Israel's greatest leader not to leave behind famous heirs, perhaps to prevent anyone from confusing purpose with inheritance, perhaps to remind us that the calling is individual, and that the most sacred altar may be the one that history never recorded, but heaven never forgot. If this narrative has touched you in any way, don't let it die here. Share it with someone who, like Gershom, might be feeling forgotten or out of place. Also, leave your comment. Which part of this story resonated most with you? This could spark a conversation that heals more than you imagine. The silence about Moses' children teaches us that for God, anonymity is never absence. Sometimes the greatest legacy you can leave is to remain faithful even when no one sees. Did you enjoy this journey? Then hit the like button, not out of habit, but as a sign that this word truly reached you. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe. Here, each video is an invitation to dive deeper into the nuances of the word. And before you go, let me give you some advice. Watch the next video that's on the screen. It reveals a secret that no one talks about regarding another biblical character who vanished into thin air. And the reason might surprise you.